So one thing I want to update you all on, this weekend I got really ahead of myself. I have practiced all of the lectures up until test 3. Therefore, the key terms are up to date up until test 3. I've added everything that I'll be added up to test 3. We are behind where I thought we would be in social psychology. So most of today we'll be finishing social psychology. We'll get started a bit on personality. But this sort of works out because as I was practicing the lectures, it turns out that chapter 15, which is stress, coping, and health, will be somewhat shorter than the other. So it should work out such that we have enough time for some review on test review day, but yeah, we'll see. And of course, a reminder, the APA assignment is due on Thursday, 11:59. So get started on that if you haven't already. Follow the template. As I said last class, strongly discourage creativity. For 2 classes, whenever I said it. Okay. So the remaining sections in social psychology are a bit of a roller coaster. It goes from bad to good to bad. So we'll be talking about outgroup bias and prejudice. Then we'll be talking about helping, and then closing it off with aggression. So a bit of a roller coaster, the remaining part of the chapter. But we'll start with prejudice. And there are 3 terms that you should know. They're conceptually distinct, but they can mutually reinforce each other. Stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So in theory, these can be distinct, but they do have a tendency to mutually reinforce. We sometimes use these interchangeably, but here's the difference. Stereotypes are beliefs. They are generalized beliefs about outcomes. So if you have a particular belief about an ethnic group or about women or men or whatever the group is, that's a stereotype. These can be positive or negative in terms of their content. So it could be Asians are better at math, or it could be a negative one, but it can, or it sometimes can, but need not always be associated with the other ones. So prejudice, which is the next one, has built into the definition negative emotional content. It means you dislike another group. Stereotypes can lead to prejudice, of course, but conceptually, that's what it is. And it comes from the word judge. It means prejudge. You dislike another group before even meeting the members. So prejudice is an affective state where you don't like members of another group. And lastly, discrimination is overt behavior that's directed towards members of another group. So if you, sorry?
What was discrimination?
Discrimination is behavior directed towards outgroup members. So if you wouldn't hire someone of a certain group, if you would believe that intermarriage between groups of members of other groups should be banned, things like that would be discrimination, where it's not just things going on in your head, but actual negative behavior directed towards members of the outgroup. So stereotype, generalized beliefs about members of outgroups, prejudice, disliking of members of the outgroup, and discrimination, negative behavior directed towards members of the outgroup, be it a religious group, ethnic group, or what have you. Now, stereotyping, one thing I want to say about this is it comes out of a natural human tendency, which is we like to categorize things. Obviously, in the case of human groups, it has bad consequences. But to show you where it probably comes from, I'm going to show you all an object that you have never seen before. None of you have ever seen this particular object. You've probably seen similar ones, but you've not seen this particular one. Someone tell me what's inside this object. Oh, everyone got it. Now, you don't know that for sure. This is a unique individual. Why are you all generalizing? I mean, what you're doing, of course, is you're picking up on patterns from past experience. Now, in this case, you guys get it right, because in the case of packs of gum, they tend to be very uniform. In the case of human beings, of course, any group is going to have a tremendous amount of variation. So this is a case in which generalizing goes wrong, but that's probably the basis of it. We are pattern-seeking animals. We like to see patterns, even if in some cases they aren't real patterns. So that's what those three mean. Any questions about those terms? Okay, one difficulty with measuring negative attitudes towards outgroup members is in our culture, it's negatively viewed if you have racist attitudes. It's strongly discouraged, and people therefore may not be forthcoming about their attitudes. If you just ask people, are you racist? People tend not to say yes to that. And so psychologists have come up with some interesting ways of trying to get at implicit attitudes. This is a controversial concept, but there are some clever ways of measuring it. One famous one, which I'll show you all, is the implicit association test. Have any of you seen this or heard of this? So the book mentions this. It's called the IAT for short. Implicit association test. Now, you can actually use this for almost any belief that you like, but it's been most famously applied to attitudes towards outgroup members, and I'll actually show you all what this looks like. So you can literally look it up when you go home. You can test yourself for implicit bias. So here's the options. So probably the most famous one is the race IAT. As you can see, there's other examples. So before I click through it, the way it will work is there will be words or pictures of faces in the middle. And then on the left and right, you have to click buttons that correspond either to the left or the right side of the screen. And so for the first part, the rule is, if you see a good word, like happy, beautiful, whatever, or a white face, you click right. If you see a black face or a negative word, click left. And then you switch it. They don't just do that. So then you have to do the same thing, but now it's good word or black face, right. White face or negative word, left. And you may be thinking, what about the order? Does that matter? And of course they randomize the order. My memory of the literature is that the order effects tend to be pretty small, but when doing studies, they of course randomize the order. Okay, whatever. I'm just gonna make stuff up. Don't want you all knowing stuff about me. I'm an old baby. So yeah, so you'll click E for items that belong to white, and I for things that are black. I mean, we don't have to do it all now, but so that's the way the test works out. So it starts off getting you used to it, and then towards the end, you'll do it with good and bad words as well. So the way that this is used to measure in-group or out-group bias is you measure how long it takes people to do it when it's good words and black faces versus when it's good words and white faces. And you find that on average, people are somewhat slower to press the button when it's good words and black faces. And you can measure how much longer it takes them. You just calculate a different score. So that's how implicit bias is defined in that test. And no one disputes that that exists. You can find this is a pattern, that people on average tend to take longer to click the button when it's good words and black faces. The question is, does that matter? does this reflect some kind of implicit bias or unconscious association? And so there you look at things like predictive validity. Does the difference score on this test predict any real-world behavior? That is an area of ongoing controversy. You don't need to know the details of that, but so I think one study they did was they would give people this test, and then they put people in a room, and they measured how far away people sat from members of outgroups. And I believe there was a correlation, though who knows if it replicated. You don't need to know the details, but that's the kind of thing that they look at using this test. Any questions about this? Two different theories of the motivational roots of prejudice are realistic conflict theory and social identity theory. These are not mutually exclusive. They could both be factors. Realistic conflict theory says that racial prejudice and other forms of prejudice increase when resources are scarce. So there are indeed studies finding that when the economy is not doing so well, measures of racial prejudice tend to go up. People start to kind of hunker down, they want to stick with their in-group, they blame the scarcity of resources on minority groups. This is a pattern that has been replicated. And they even did an experiment where they got a bunch of kids into a summer camp. This is the Robbers Cave study. Robbers Cave was the name of the summer camp. It's done by someone named Sharif. I think it was done in the United States. And these were all white kids, but they divided them into two teams, the Rattlers and the Eagles, so two teams. And Sharif, who was the kind of in charge of the camp, caused various problems, various deficits, and various. I think he messed up the plumbing and various other things. And when there were scarce resources and competition, the groups started to hate each other. So they got into fist fights. They even started making stereotypes about the other group. So this whole intergroup conflict. What the book doesn't mention is that Sharif found that there was one highly effective way of reducing the intergroup conflict. So first he made the groups hate each other, but then he made a way for them to stop hating each other, which was a superordinate goal. He made himself the common enemy of the two groups and gave them various projects that they could only achieve, or goals they could only achieve when they worked together, sometimes against him. And that greatly reduced the hatred between the two groups. So to be clear, a superordinate goal is some kind of goal that the groups have to work together on to solve or to achieve. Yeah. And one easy way to do this is to have a common enemy, though not the only way. Yes?
So would we say when prejudice decreases, or all prejudice?
This is discussed in the context of prejudice. I mean, they kind of tend to go together, but the section is technically on prejudice. Now, there's a clip that kind of went viral. Lots of reels and memes use this. This is the best visualization of how common enemies bring people together that I've ever seen. It's a clip from the movie Ted. Some of you may recognize it. Warning, there's a lot of swearing in it. They cram a lot of swear words into 45 seconds, so plug your ears if that offends your sensibilities, but it really could not be a better visualization. So as I say, really couldn't visualize it any better than that. Okay, so that's realistic conflict theory. Social identity theory says that outgroup prejudice can function to increase one's self-esteem. So if you build up your group and say my group's the best and these other groups are not so good, that can be a way of making yourself feel better. So there are studies consistent with that, with the idea that raising self-esteem decreases outgroup prejudice, and vice versa. Decreasing self-esteem increases outgroup prejudice. Any questions about these two theories of prejudice? Yeah.
For realistic conflict theory, is it like racial prejudice heightens when facing disaster?
Yeah, so when there's bad economy, scarce resources, or other kinds of deficits in the world, people tend to gravitate to racial prejudice as a way of kind of scapegoating or blaming other groups. Okay, the next one, this is an idea that has been subject to some skepticism following the replication crisis, but you should at least know what it is. And that's the idea of stereotype threat. The idea here is that awareness of stereotypes can wind up making you confirm them. Awareness of stereotypes can wind up making you confirm them. The mechanism by which this is proposed to happen is, if you're aware of a stereotype, say about intelligence, and you have to do some kind of standardized test, this can increase your anxiety and harm your performance, thereby making you confirm the stereotype. So the standard way of testing this is you bring people into the lab. So one example is there's a stereotype that women are not as good at math, which turns out to not be true, but it is a stereotype that exists. And so you bring women into the lab, and you randomly assign them to two groups. In one group, they have to identify their gender before doing the test, and in one condition they do not. And the finding is women do worse when they have to identify their gender beforehand. So the idea here is when you're reminded of your gender, the stereotypes are also brought to mind, which causes anxiety, which makes you do worse. Note that the same effect does not occur if you have someone indicate their ethnic group if they are East Asian. So you have to indicate your ethnicity. In that case, of course, there's not a negative stereotype about math performance. And so performance does not go down. So some of these findings may or may not replicate. There's some ongoing controversy about it, but that's at least the idea, that awareness of stereotypes can lead to confirming via causing this kind of anxiety that would wind up confirming it. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? One method for reducing prejudice, which is of course a good goal, is what the book calls equal status contact. According to the book, this is sort of four things together. When these four conditions are met, studies indicate that you can reduce prejudice. So the first condition is sustained close contact, so lots of interaction with members of an outgroup. Two, this is where equal status comes from, they have to have equal status. So if the only people of another ethnic group that you see are your employees, may not be the most effective way to reduce prejudice. So they're on equal footing. Number 3 is one we've already mentioned, which is a superordinate goal, some kind of common goal that they have to work towards. And 4, their cooperation is supported by broader social norms. So that's equal status contact. One method that has mixed results, in fact in some studies may even have negative results, is negating or arguing against racial stereotypes. So there's a bit of a paradox here where if you just repeatedly say this stereotype is false, what you inadvertently wind up doing is reinforcing it. In fact, there are some studies in the case of the IAT, which I mentioned earlier, that what the IAT is partly measuring is how aware are you of stereotypes. Even if you're a good lefty who believes that they're not true, there can be effects wherein that actually winds up inadvertently reinforcing them. So it's better to present positive information instead of just arguing against or negating negative information. Yes? The first one of the 4? Yeah, so for equal, so this last point I just made is not about equal status contact, but yeah, for equal status contact, the first one is engage in sustained close contact. Do I need to repeat any of the other 4 for which one? I'll just go through all 4. So number 1, engage in sustained close contact. 2, equal status. 3, a superordinate or common goal. And 4, support from the broader social norms.
Did you say 4 or from?
4. Yeah. And then the last thing for the prejudice section, you don't need to know the details here, but there have been studies trying to find what the book calls a shooter bias. Some of these studies were done in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, so famous instances of unarmed people being shot by police. What you do is you put people in a computer simulation where they have to decide whether or not to shoot, and there's some ambiguous situation, like someone reaches for an object that may be a phone or may be a gun, and you have to make split-second decisions. And some of these studies find a racial bias, wherein if the person reaching for an object is African American, you are more likely to perceive it as a gun and shoot. Again, you don't need to know the details of how many milliseconds or whatever, but that's what the shooter bias refers to. Okay, that wraps up the prejudice section. Any questions on anything in that section?
For the shooter bias that you just mentioned, is it just white people who shoot at the black person more, or also the black?
That's a good question. I vaguely remember hearing that no, it was not unique to just white people doing the study, but I'd have to double check, so don't quote me on that. Other final questions?
Could you give an example of what number 4 is?
Yeah, so support from the broader social norms. The idea there is just, if the broader social norms are, against racism and against intergroup prejudice, it's easier to go along with the equal status contact. So to make it really simple, it would be easier, or equal status contact numbers 1 through 3, those elements would be more effective doing them now than in the 1920s, to take a really extreme case. Okay. So next is pro-social behavior. So as far as mammals go, humans are a pretty altruistic species. We definitely have a selfish bend, but compared to some of our mammalian relatives, we're not all that bad. We do often help others. And this is a little bit surprising when you think about things from an evolutionary lens, at least a simplistic evolutionary lens, because evolution works by getting your genes passed on. Right? That's how evolution works. It selects for traits that increase your chance of spreading your genes. So why would anyone help? And there are some evolutionary explanations we reviewed in 104 having to do with kin selection and reciprocal altruism. We won't be going over that, but I direct you there if you're interested. This section is on social and psychological influences on altruism. Two social or cultural influences are two types of norms, one of which we've already talked about, which is the norm of reciprocity. Reciprocity just means, if someone helps me, I'm supposed to help them. This actually relates to one of the evolutionary explanations too, but in this context, it's conceptualized as a societal or cultural norm. And the second one is the norm of social responsibility. And this one is broader than the first one. This is about being a good citizen or a helpful person in general, not just being nice to people who have been nice to you, but giving some money to the homeless guy, being volunteering in the food bank, just in general being a helpful, good citizen, not only for people who are nice to you. At the psychological level, there are two different things that psychologists have put forward. One is the empathy altruism hypothesis. So altruism means like self-sacrifice, like giving up something to help someone else. And this idea says it's empathy that causes that. It's being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and feel their pain. So if you walk by a homeless person, you think, oh, if that was me, I would be in so much pain or I'd be so sad. That makes me want to help them. Because I can imagine seeing the world through their eyes. The other one is the negative state relief hypothesis. And the idea here is when you see someone who's suffering, you feel unpleasant. You feel guilty. You feel like, oh, that looks really unpleasant. I'd feel bad if I didn't do anything, and I give money so that I feel less bad. It's not that I'm empathizing or seeing the world through their eyes. I just don't want to feel guilty. So I give to reduce my own negative emotional state. So you don't have to worry about the details of the studies or which is more correct, but that's what those two refer to. So next is kind of some bad news that I think I mentioned in passing back in chapter 2. People often don't help. I mentioned that we are more altruistic than some of our mammalian relatives, but there's a famous finding called the bystander effect. Well, actually, before I say what the effect is, psychologists started doing work on this after the murder of Kitty Genovese, which I think I mentioned in chapter 2. This woman who was brutally murdered in New York, large apartment complex nearby. Even though people heard the screams, it took a long time to call 911, let alone help her. And psychologists started doing experiments, and what they found was when you bring people into the lab and introduce a fake emergency, like someone has a seizure or smoke comes into the room or any potential emergency, the more people there are in the room, the less likely it is that anyone will help. So that's just the finding. There's different explanations of it. Before going through the explanations, I'll show a video of this in action. Okay, so pretty depressing finding. So two different explanations, one of which the video referred to. The first one is the diffusion of responsibility. So diffusion is like when something is spread out, like a diffuse mixture or whatever. The idea here is when there's more people, everyone thinks someone else will do it. But then everyone thinks that, so no one does anything. This is why when you're in an emergency and you're helping someone, you never say, someone call 911. You say, you call 911. Because if you just say, someone call 911, everyone will think someone else will do it. Another explanation, which the video doesn't directly refer to, is pluralistic ignorance. So here's another example of these studies. You have people in the lab, and I think I mentioned this in passing, smoke comes in, right? And people are sitting in the waiting room waiting for the experiment. They don't know this actually is the experiment, is the smoke coming in. And if there's one person, they get up pretty quick. They're like, this doesn't look good, I'm leaving. 3 people, it takes everyone a bit longer. 10 people, it takes them the longest. Pluralistic ignorance has kind of a funny definition. It will sound kind of strange, but I'll say it and then I'll explain it. Pluralistic ignorance means nobody believes it, but everyone believes that everyone else believes it. So I'll say that again, then I'll make it more concrete. So no one believes it, but everyone believes that everyone else believes it. So take the smoke example. People try to guess what other people believe based on their behavior. So you look around, and the question you're asking is, do they believe that it's safe? Do they believe this room is safe? You look around, no one's getting up. Okay, I don't think it's safe, but they're all sitting still. They probably believe it's safe. But everyone thinks that. Everyone thinks, I don't think it's safe, but no one's getting up, so they all must believe that it's safe. Another example, they've done studies of fraternities that have like dumb rituals, which I've mentioned in other contexts. So, let's say they drink beer every Friday till they throw up. That's what they do. You ask everyone, do you think that drinking beer until you throw up is cool? Like one-on-one. And they all say, no, I think it's pretty stupid, but all my fraternity brothers, they all think it's really cool. But everyone says that. They're inferring what the belief is based on the behavior, the beliefs of others, and inferring, well, everyone else must believe this is cool, even though none of them actually believe it. So, in the bystander case, you look around, no one's helping, so you infer, well, they all must think this is okay. But everyone's doing that, so no one actually thinks that it's okay. So a bit of a wordy definition, but does pluralistic ignorance make sense? Okay. So those work against people helping. 5 things that increase helping. Number 1 is self-efficacy. This is a term that's going to come up later. In more detail, self-efficacy is just belief in your own effectiveness. So you believe that you could help, right? So if you know first aid, you'll be higher on self-efficacy, for example. Two that might seem to go against each other, but they're all roads lead to Rome. I guess. There's different ways to get to Rome, anyways. If you're in a good mood, or if you're in a specific kind of bad mood, namely a guilty one, those increase your chances of helping. So just being sad wouldn't help, but if you're specifically feeling guilty already, that will help. If there's a role model, so we kind of saw that in the video, good role model increases your chance of helping. And lastly, and this one exerts a pretty big effect, if you are not in a hurry. Now, we would probably like to think that other personal traits would help, things like religious beliefs or dispositions like that. But there's one very depressing study, specifically on this last one, that maybe partly counts against that. How many of you know the story of the Good Samaritan? Maybe half. So this is an old religious story. It's one of Jesus' parables. So there's a man walking to Jericho, and what's happened? I think he's attacked by robbers. So he's left beaten up, alone in the street, and a bunch of people pass him by and don't help until finally a Samaritan, who was kind of like a racial outgroup at the time. So it's not the one anyone expected to be the good person, but the Samaritan helps him out. So it's usually used as a story of helping people. So here's a study they did with this story. They got a bunch of people in seminary, so people studying to be religious ministers, and randomly assigned them to 2 conditions. Well, really 6. So it was they manipulated multiple independent variables, and I'll break this down carefully. One way in which they randomly assigned people was they were all told, you have to walk to this room in the building and give a sermon, give a talk. One group, they have to give a talk on the Good Samaritan, right? This story about helping someone who's in need. In the other one, they have to give a talk on like jobs or something, some morally neutral topic. And then they manipulated how much time they had to get there. People in this column were told, if you leave now, you'll be early. People in this column were told, if you leave now, you'll be just barely on time. And people in this column are told, you are already late. So those are the 6 conditions. So half are told, give a talk on the Good Samaritan, about helping people. Half are told, give a talk about this neutral topic, namely jobs. And then early, on time, or late. On their walk towards this room was a man who looked, kind of like in this video, who looked like he was ill. He was like writhing in pain. And the question is, how many people in these different conditions helped the man who was suffering? And what you found was, in the early group, 65% did. 45% of people in the on-time condition, and 10% of people in the late condition. So a very large effect of whether or not you're in a hurry. The question then is, does this make any difference? Does the fact that you're thinking about the Good Samaritan increase your chance of helping? And the answer is no. It made no difference. So all of the effect was driven by just whether or not you're in a hurry. So that's kind of a depressing finding. One other depressing finding, they looked at effects of gender. Women are equally likely to help someone, whether it is a male or a female, whereas males are statistically more likely to help if it is a woman. That's a little depressing. So that's another variable that's been studied. And then one final variable that works against helping, and actually works against a number of other things too, is the just world bias. The just world bias, in the book it says the just world hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis about a bias that we have. This is the tendency to believe that the world is just, that the world is fair, that people get what they deserve. So when someone succeeds, our default is to think they probably deserve it. They probably worked hard. If someone has a rough life, your default is to assume, they probably deserve it. Right? They probably messed up. You see a homeless person, you think, bad self-control, or whatever. And the people who put this idea forward argue that the reason we have this bias is it makes us feel safe. It's nice to think that the world is fair and just, because of course, we all think we are good people, so nothing bad would happen to us. This leads to things like blaming the victim, which actually both men and women engage in, like say in the context of sexual assault. If someone gets sexually assaulted, and you tell yourself, well, life is unfair, sometimes random bad shit happens to normal people, well, that makes me feel unsafe, because then it could happen to me. If I say, no, it was her fault, well, then I feel like the world is more safe and controllable, because then I can take steps to make sure it doesn't happen to me. It's not just random and unfair. And as an example of someone showing this bias, I have a clip of a stand-up. So yeah, couldn't say it any better. That is almost the definition of the just world bias. The right people always win. So this can also work against people helping others, right? They tend to believe that, there's a reason why he's suffering. Okay. That's the end of the pro-social behavior and helping section. Any questions? Good. Self-efficacy is belief in your own effectiveness. So belief that you can do things. So in the context of helping, the example I used was if you know first aid, right? You would probably have higher self-efficacy because you believe that you would know what to do. Yes. That's a good question. So the question is, do religious people have more of a just world bias? Because many religions have the idea of, some religions explicitly have karma, right, where good things happen to good people. Even in Western religious context, there's usually some version of that. So the question is, do religious people have more just world bias? And I don't know. So my version of I don't know is do an honors thesis on that. So, or maybe someone's already done it. Okay. So the final topic for the social psychology section is aggression. So humans are mammals, so we, in addition to having the capacity for helping people, we also have the capacity for harming others. The section starts off with some of the biological variables. So like virtually every human trait, aggressive tendencies do have a genetic component. So standard method, you should all be familiar with by now, is you look at twins. So identical twins raised apart tend to be more similar than chance in terms of their aggressive tendencies. And if you look at identical twins raised in the same family, they are more similar for aggression than non-identical twins raised in the same family. Identical twins share twice as many genes, and that bonus genetic similarity does make a difference. It does make the twins more similar in terms of their disposition towards violence. Specific regions of the brain that are involved include the hypothalamus, and the amygdala. The hypothalamus is basically the boss of the hormone system. Those who were in my 104 class will know, you probably forgot this, the brain regions are hard to remember, but this is the part that's involved in the 4 F's of survival. Feeding, fleeing, fighting, and something else. That's a nice, easy way to remember what the hypothalamus does, because it's in charge of the hormone system. So obviously that's the connection, and one of them is fighting. So it does have a role in aggression. And the amygdala is typically thought of as an emotion center of the brain. It's involved in many different emotions, but the emotions for which the evidence is strongest is that it's involved in fear and aggression. So these are both part of the limbic system, these two structures. A part of the brain that acts against aggression, typically, is the frontal lobes. So humans have very large frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes are involved in, among other things, self-control, kind of dampening down the impulses of the limbic system. Two hormones that are involved are serotonin and testosterone. Or two hormones. So serotonin, if people are low in serotonin, they tend to have more of a tendency towards impulsive aggression. Some have argued that serotonin, low serotonin is kind of your brain's way of keeping track of your status. So if you're low, it's kind of like, I'm kind of low status, I'm not very high up in the hierarchy, and that may be why it predisposes you to impulsive aggression, because you know that you don't have a lot to lose, you may try something crazy to boost your status. That's one way of thinking about it. The connection between testosterone and aggression will not be surprising to any of you, so obviously males have more testosterone on average, and if you go to prisons, you will see that that's mostly men. So this is involved in aggression, particularly social aggression, that's aimed at dominance, at dominating other people. Before I move on to social and psychological variables, any questions about these? Yes.
The hypothalamus are the 4 F's, fighting, fleeing, feeding,
And something else, you can say sexual functioning, so I can keep my job. So those are the some of the biological underpinnings. Obviously, this is an oversimplification. There are other neurotransmitters and brain regions involved, but that's good enough for an intro course. One psychological hypothesis is the frustration-aggression hypothesis. This is a pretty simple idea. It just says that when your goals are frustrated, your tendency to engage in aggression increases. So this is not just the subjective feeling of being frustrated. This is like when you have a goal and it's not achieved. It's frustration in that kind of operational sense. And there are indeed several studies finding that this is the case, that when your goals are not achieved, your tendency to engage in aggression increases. And then, I won't write these all down, but 4 situational variables that increase your likelihood of engaging in aggression. These will not be surprising. Physical pain. If you're in pain, you're more likely to resort to violence. If you're provoked, so if you're insulted in some way or what have you. Crowding. So I'm sure you've had the experience of walking down the halls of the university and you just want to hit somebody if it's really crowded in the halls. So there's another one. And lastly, heat. it's hotter outside, more likely to get pissed off and hit somebody. They've even done this in like baseball, like sporting events. On hotter summer days, there is a greater likelihood of fights breaking out. And of course, none of these is fully determinative, right? I mean, people still get into fights in hockey and stuff like that, but these, on average, will increase the likelihood of violence. And then the final term before we talk about catharsis and social learning is the attribution of intentionality. This is when you think someone is doing something to you on purpose. So remember, attribution is when you explain someone else's behavior. So if you think someone else is harming you on purpose, the finding is it's actually experienced as more painful. They did some really direct studies on this, where they had you hooked up to electric shock, and you were told someone in another room controls how much you'll get shocked, and then you get repeatedly electrocuted. Not like seriously, but enough to be unpleasant, enough for it to be unpleasant. In one condition, you were told, the guy in the other room, he's doing it on purpose. He knows he's shocking you when he's pushing that button. In the other condition, they're told, he doesn't know. He's pushing this button for a different reason. And two things happen. Number one, when you're in the on purpose condition, the shocks are subjectively experienced as more painful, and the pain stays high. In the other condition, you habituate. After repeated shocks, it becomes less painful, even if they're at the same intensity. If you think they're on purpose, the pain stays high. You're stewing there, pissed off at this guy in the other room, so you don't habituate. Any questions on these before we move on to the last two terms?
When I think about sex differences and or is attribution of intentionality like something, like any sort of internal behavior that people make assume the best of them or whatever?
Are you saying, is there a sex difference in how much men and women attribute intentionality to others,
Yeah,
or in how much they attribute it if it's a man or a woman who's hurting?
Without being told, if somebody cuts you off, is there more anger that
Are they more mad if it's a man than if it's a woman, or vice versa?
No, are men or women more likely to say, oh, they did that on purpose, or oh, they were just trying to get...
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure, actually. But it's an interesting question. Another honors thesis topic. Okay, so the last, as I say, pair of terms, these are two theories from very different theoretical traditions, and they lead to different predictions. One is catharsis, which comes from Freud, our good friend Freud. And the other is social learning theory, which comes from Bandura. So Freud, who we'll be talking a bit about at the end of class to kick off the personality chapter, Freud thought that we had inborn aggressive tendencies and that we needed an outlet. So if we do kind of mock aggression, we can release our aggressive impulses. So you play a violent video game, you have a kind of friendly boxing match with your friend or whatever, some gentler version of it, as long as it's somewhat aggressive, it can allow for catharsis, for the releasing of these aggressive impulses. Social learning theory says that we learn how to behave by watching other people. So you may remember from 104, the Bobo doll study. Bandura did that. So this is the study where kids are in two conditions. They both watch adults interact with a Bobo doll. In one condition, the adult does nothing with the Bobo doll. In the other condition, the adult beats the crap out of the Bobo doll. Then you let the kids alone with the Bobo doll, and unsurprisingly, if they watch an adult beat up the Bobo doll, that's what the kids do. Monkey see, monkey do. So one area where these two theories have been tested is video games. So, very controversial area. Do video games increase the likelihood of engaging in violence? And the book talks about various studies. The meta-analyses that the book discusses tend to find that the effects are generally small, but they're generally consistent with the social learning theory. However, there's a lot of nuance to be added to these studies, and rather than add it myself, I'm going to close with a video from Hank Green talking about some of the studies that have been done in this area. So that'll be the end of the social psych, but then we'll spend the last maybe 10 minutes of class just getting into personality a little bit. So watch this. Okay, so the extra terms in that video are not testable. This is just to show you kind of some of the complexities of the issue. But yes.
What's the standard ways by which this is measured or pressure?
So one example that he mentioned is, you have to give like loud noise blasts after. Like you have the option to. Now, so one trade-off in a lot of psychology studies, and this is a good example, is the trade-off between experimental control and being realistic. So you can't give people opportunities to do like real violence in the lab, obviously. If you want to look at that, you can only do correlational studies, right? You can correlate video games with violence in the real world, but then the trouble there is it's just correlational. So then you don't know if it's, is it the case that people who are more violent play more video games, or is the causal error going the other way? So the alternative is to do it in a lab where you can have more experimental control, but the measure of violence may not be as realistic. But yes.
Is that the best we got, like comparative reaction time tests?
Compared to what, sorry?
Is that the best we've got? Like last exams?
I don't know if it's the best way. This isn't an area like I'm an expert, and that's just one example that he gave. I'm sure people have thought of others. Okay, that is the last stuff for social psych. We still have some time, so we'll just get a little bit into personality for the next 10 minutes or so. So, what is personality? So the definition that the book gives is a good one, and it includes 5 components, 5 features of the definition. One is it should be distinctive, right? It should be something that's different between people. That's, in the case of any person, is going to be at least somewhat unique to them. Number 2, it should be relatively enduring or stable. It should be an attribute of you that persists across time. Being happy in the morning is not a personality, right? Mood is different because mood changes throughout the day or the week or the year. Personality is conceptualized as something that's more long-lasting. So those are 2 features, and then but the core feature is it's a particular pattern of thought, emotion, and behavior. So what personality is it's a person's tendency to think, feel, and behave in particular ways across time. So if you want to put it in one sentence, it is a distinctive, enduring, pattern of thought, emotion, and behavior. So that's the definition of personality. And the first theorist of personality that we'll be talking about is Sigmund Freud. And we won't get into the weirdest parts of this today, but we'll at least get into it a bit. This is the single weirdest section of the book. This is where all the weirdness of Freud is just condensed. We will also see, I think, some aspects of Freud that are insightful and worth talking about, but we also do have to talk about some of the craziness. As I think I mentioned in my 104 class, there are basically two different skill sets that you need to be a good scientist. At least in the way Karl Popper conceptualized things. Science is a process of conjecture and refutation. So conjecture is where you make a guess, a hypothesis, make something up. And refutation is, at least attempted refutation, you try to prove your theory wrong or your guess wrong. And if it survives your attempt to prove it wrong, you hold on to it, at least tentatively. And these two steps kind of require different skills. The conjecturing step actually requires creativity. This is one thing that some people struggle with when they transition from undergrad to graduate school, is that you have to sometimes make stuff up. And there's no real rational rule set for making stuff up. You have to be creative. The step two is where you have to become more rational and computational. So, okay, how would I test this idea and try to prove it wrong? Freud was really good at step one. He was really good at making stuff up. He was a very creative man. He was not so good at rigorously testing all of his ideas, though some of them, as I will say later, some of them have stood up to tests fairly well. And actually, maybe I'll just end a bit early and leave you all in suspense. So next time, we will start with Freud's actual ideas. So see you all on